a monarchy, or a corrupt tyrannical aristocracy. That's what George Mason predicted we'd get under the Constitution. But he was far from alone. The Anti-Federalists repeatedly warned that we wouldn't end up with a federal union of states. We'd get a consolidated national government instead. They pointed to all kinds of weapons that they saw were baked into the system that would guarantee this outcome. Today, I've got 5 of the big ones, like taxation, that they said would absolutely crush liberty, from 5 of the leading anti-federalist voices, including Mason, plus Elbridge Gerry, Cato, the Pennsylvania Dissent, and Luther Martin. Were they right? Let's find out. But first of all, before getting to that, welcome, and thank you for joining me here on the path to liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Friday, October 24th, 2025. And to kick this off, let's start out with those first 3 very famous words, the preamble, we the people, because that's where the address and reasons of dissent of the minority of the Convention of the State of Pennsylvania. This was a group of people who worked together. We'll call them the Pennsylvania Dissent. They published their reasons for opposing ratification because they couldn't get it in the official journal. So the Pennsylvania Dissent started right there as well. They said, in short, consolidation pervades the whole Constitution. It begins with an enunciation that such was the intention. The main pillars of the fabric correspond with it, they wrote, and the concluding paragraph is a confirmation of it. They were really sure of this view. They said the preamble begins with the words, we the people of the United States, which is the style of a compact between individuals entering into a state of society, and not that of a confederation of states. And in his third anti-federalist essay, we don't know who wrote it, Cato pointed to the preamble as well as clear evidence of a destruction of the federal system that they had under the Articles of Confederation. He said the recital or premises on which the new form of government is erected declares a consolidation or union of all the 13 parts or states into one great whole under the firm of the United States for all the various and important purposes therein set forth. That's the rest of the preamble. Now, consolidation was considered by everyone. Even the Federalist side said they were opposed to consolidation. Now, a few of them there probably secretly loved it. We know that for a fact, like Hamilton. But everyone claimed to be opposed to consolidation because it was death to liberty. It's just that the Anti-Federalists said, well, this is going to guaranteed give it to us. And the Federalists were saying, no. And that was what a lot of the debate really was about. But as George Mason explained, this whole system, a consolidated system as they saw it, would be a rejection of all the principles that they fought for in the American Revolution and then built under the Articles of Confederation. He said the very idea of converting what was formerly Confederation to a consolidated government is totally subversive of every principle which has hitherto governed us. And Elbridge Gerry, he took aim at the idea because, of course, some people are saying this is partly federal, partly national. And he's saying that's not partly anything, really. He said the Constitution proposed has few, if any, federal features, but is rather a system of national government. And Luther Martin of Maryland, he really explained the key thing that makes the difference here. What is a federal system versus a national one? Well, national one is not what we have here, how way he describes it. He said a federal government is formed by the states as states. That is, in their sovereign capacities, in the same manner as treaties and alliances are formed. And this really represented the biggest change. No one was hiding it. It wasn't a secret. The Constitution was intentionally designed to empower the new federal government to operate directly on individuals rather than through the states, and the states would act on individuals. For example, the tax requisition system, which people like James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and many others absolutely despised, but people like Luther Martin, Patrick Henry, and others on the Anti-Federalist side thought was essential. This was a system where Congress would actually come up with tabulate how much each state owed in taxes, and those states would go out and figure out how they were going to collect it, and if they would. And then the states would actually either turn in the money or maybe not. And so there was a lot of complaint on the Federalist side, and that's what drove many of them at the Philadelphia Convention to draft what they called a more high-tone system, more energy in government, so they could raise the revenue that they wanted to have in order to do the things they wanted to do. Anyways, I covered that distinction in much more detail in a recent episode, We the People versus We the States, the Constitution's Real Purpose. Now, as a result of what they saw as consolidation pervading the entire system, the Pennsylvania dissent asserted that this consolidated system could only end up in a total tyranny. They said, from the nature of things, this will be an iron-handed despotism, as nothing short of the supremacy of despotic sway could connect and govern these United States under one government. Now, they didn't just name the problem. They, of course, all throughout these various anti-federalist essays and papers, and even the ones that I'm not covering here, they repeatedly pointed to various weapons baked into the system that would guarantee this outcome. And I think one of the most common themes was an opposition to federal taxing power. Now, mind you, we're just talking about the General Welfare Clause here, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. This is over a century before the 16th Amendment, which is 1913, was a terrible year. We'll also talk about the 17th here in a moment. But this is over a century before the 16th Amendment actually made things much, much, much worse. Here, back to Pennsylvania, they said, in short, every species of taxation, whether of an external or internal nature, is comprised in Section the 8th of Article the 1st. The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts, and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. George Mason, he specifically said during the Virginia Ratifying Convention, right at the beginning, he specifically said that this one clause alone, on its own, was enough to turn a confederation into a consolidated national system. He said the assumption of this power of laying direct taxes does of itself entirely change the confederation of the states into one consolidated government. He said this power being at discretion, unconfined, and without any kind of control, must carry everything before it. Now think of what the impact of this. Again, it's over a century before the 16th Amendment, and I'm sure if you're like me, if somehow the 16th was just gone tomorrow, we'd be cheering, oh, okay, we're going to live free, or at least we're much freer. But even without that, this wasn't even on the table. A direct income tax, individual income tax wasn't even being discussed. And we're talking about imposts and duties and excises. And people like George Mason are saying just that on its own, without the 16th Amendment, was enough to create the dreaded consolidation. And Luther Martin, man, he really warned that they'd use this power to squeeze us dry till not a drop would be left. He said it will, by the imposition of the variety of taxes, imposts, stamps, excises, and other duties, squeeze from them the little money they may acquire, the hard earnings of their industry, as you would squeeze the juice from an orange, till not a drop more can be extracted. And Elbridge Gerry, in his letter to James Warren, this is in October 1787, October 18th, right up there on the screen. Man, he had the most brutal analogy of how taxation would play out. He said, the people will bleed with taxes at every pore, and that the existence of their liberties will soon be terminated. Now, all that taxation that they were expecting, now, of course, they were expecting, again, this is well before the 16th Amendment, but they knew it would have to be enforced. And the Pennsylvania Anti-Federalists, they predicted that this would be basically an excuse for a standing army to do enforcement internally, the bane of liberty. They said a standing army in the hands of a government placed so independent of the people may be made a fatal instrument to overturn the public liberties. It may, they wrote, be employed to enforce the collection of the most oppressive taxes and to carry into execution the most arbitrary measures. Now, arbitrary power, that was what the whole Declaration of Independence was all about. We always refer to them, that list of charges against Parliament and the King, as being grievances. The word grievances isn't in the text. They're injuries and usurpations, abuses and usurpations. Arbitrary power is listed there. These are all basically the same thing, an exercise of power that's not legally authorized to the government. So arbitrary power, they're really calling back to the revolution here with this statement. They said an ambitious man who may have the army at his devotion may step up into the throne and seize upon absolute power. So weapon number 2 is standing armies. And George Mason predicted that the power to establish a standing army, some people think that there is no such power, but it's there. He said this would result in the militia, the people themselves, as the first line of defense, the armed population of the people. He said this would result in the militia being destroyed really in practice and effect. And that really means disarming the people themselves. He said there are various ways of destroying the militia. A standing army may be perpetually established in their stead. I abominate and detest the idea of a government where there is a standing army. George Mason, tell us how you really feel. Abominate and detest the idea. He said the militia may be here destroyed by that method which has been practiced in other parts of the world before. That is, by rendering them useless, by disarming them. So if the people themselves are supposed to be the first line of defense for their own constitution, their own liberty, their own, we'll call it national defense in this situation, if you create a standing army, the people are going to be less likely to be armed and trained. They're going to rely on that army. And Mason said, well, if you do this, we're not going to have that essential line of defense. Even on the Federalist side, under President George Washington, first Secretary of War General Henry Knox said, militia, that's supposed to be the capital defense of a free country, a free republic, not a standing army. This was a very common view. Of course, there were plenty of people back then, and way more today, who believed that the federal courts were going to save us. But the Anti-Federalists weren't buying it. Not even close. And Elbridge Gerry may have had the best one-line take that described the Anti-Federalist view that the judicial department was going to make things far worse. He said the judicial department will be oppressive. And one of the great concerns, especially if you think of it in conjunction with the Supremacy Clause, was that the power of Congress to structure and regulate the federal judiciary would result in a monster that basically turned every case into a federal case. You can look these up. There's like Article 3, Section 1, Article 3, Section 2, Clause 2, etc. And the Pennsylvania dissent said the judicial powers vested in Congress are also so various and extensive that by legal ingenuity, they may be extended to every case and thus absorb the state judiciaries. Everything is a national case, of course. And George Mason said this whole system would actually make justice very difficult, if not completely unattainable for the average person like you and I. It would end up with kind of a two-tiered justice system. He said the judiciary of the United States is so constructed and extended as to absorb and destroy the judiciaries of the several states, thereby rendering law as tedious, intricate, and expensive, and justice as unattainable by a great part of the community as in England, and enabling the rich to oppress and ruin the poor. And like Mason did in regards to federal taxing power, the Pennsylvania dissent looked solely at the judicial power and said that alone was enough to create the dreaded consolidation that would guarantee destroy liberty. And this is well before the 14th Amendment and the incorporation doctrine, just like it was well before the 16th Amendment on taxing power. They said, we do not hesitate to pronounce that this power unaided by the legislative, would affect the consolidation of the states under one government. Now, I know I'm kind of running through a lot of this really important historical information pretty quickly, but it's my hope that this episode, like every single episode, serves as a bit of a highlight reel for you. And if you're the type of person who is really encouraged to read and learn more and understand this stuff, because I'm just scratching the surface, you are in luck. Because this episode, like every single episode, we publish a blog post for the show. Alan Mosley gets that organized, does an awesome job, consistent, timely, etc. Does an awesome job getting that set up. And I get it published a couple of hours after the live stream is done. You're going to see a show link section so you can look up all the stuff that I'm citing here. That's over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. But I've got one more URL I've got to give you. The reason I'm doing this episode is because even though I'm like 6 months late on this guy, I finally have in my hand, as of just yesterday, a proof copy of our new book that Mike Meharry and I spent a lot of time working on. The Anti-Federalists Were Right. Martin, Mason, Gary, Cato, and the Pennsylvania Dissenters. The Case Against Ratification. We got one chapter at the end that I think is pretty awesome. That is Luther Martin's take on federal taxing power. It closes out with this. For Luther Martin, unchecked taxation was not just bad policy. It was the gateway to a consolidated national power that would end in tyranny. Again, that's 10thamendmentcenter.com/anti-federalist. We're going to be shipping these out in the next few weeks. Once we get full stock, I've got this proof copy. I'm just going to go through it over the weekend and hopefully everything's all set. But if there's any minor changes, I'll get that handled. But if you want to pre-order one, again, it's 10thamendmentcenter.com/anti-federalist. Now let's get back to the Anti-Federalists and their what we could call their 5 weapons that we're discussing here. Next up, let's look at Congress, the House of Representatives. Cato in his 5th essay. Now, the Anti-Federalists repeatedly warned that there would be too few members in the House. It would be impossible to truly represent the people. Just couldn't happen numerically. And Cato sounds almost prophetic when he warned about the kind of corruption that we'd end up with. He said, it is a very important objection to this government that the representation consists of so few. Too few to resist the influence of corruption and the temptation to treachery, against which all governments ought to take precautions. And it wasn't just, and they all hit on this theme over and over. It's too few in the House of Representatives to actually be a house that represents the people. And when it came to the Senate, the Pennsylvania dissent saw the same issue, but it was way, way worse. And at the time, it was going to be like 25 or 26 men that could make decisions for millions. They said the sense and views of 3 or 4 millions of people diffused over so extensive a territory, comprising such various climates, products, habits, interests, and opinions, cannot be collected in so small a body. Now, one of the leading anti-federalist themes against the structure of the Senate and in general against the Constitution itself was their support for separation of powers, where legislative, executive, and judicial power should all be totally distinct for the Anti-Federalists. The Federalist side made the case they were all citing the same guy, Montesquieu, on separation of powers, and you had 2 different views of it. The Federalist side said, well, it's okay if you have a little bit of overlapping, you just can't have them all exercise one power. And the Anti-Federalist side said, no, you can't have any crossover at all. And Elbridge Gerry, for example, he pointed to the Senate and presidents as being way too mixed. He said the executive is blended with and will have undue influence over the legislature. The veto power, for example, was a legislative act. And so they didn't want that. The vice president, being at the head of the Senate, was mixing those 2 branches. Now, beyond those few things, there were actually so many warnings, so many issues that they had with the structure of the Senate. I had to do an entire episode on that. That was about a year ago. Repeal the 17th Amendment, ignored anti-federalist warnings on the Senate. The case was, hey, if you're going to think about repealing the 17th, you might want to think about how bad these people said it was going to be even before that. So again, long 6-year terms was an issue. There was a lack of recall power. George Mason really hit on that. They predicted that the Senate, rather than actually being like delegates for the states, it would really end up being like a national aristocratic branch. And Alan and I are going to make sure that that link is in the show notes as well. Again, repeal the 17th Amendment, ignored anti-federalist warnings on the Senate. Now, put it all together, all the various issues with the Senate that we're not getting into in detail here. Cato, in his 6th essay, this is December of 1787, he thought the power of the Senate would be impossible to resist. He said, when the Senate, so important a branch of the legislature, is so far removed from the people as to have little or no connection with them, when their duration in office is such as to have the resemblance to perpetuity. Mercy Otis Warren, for example, said, a Senate chosen for 6 years really in practice is going to be a Senate for life. She called it. He said, when they are connected with the executive by the appointment of all officers, and also, here's mixing of another power, to become the judiciary for the trial of officers of their own appointment. So their judiciary, in essence, against the people that they put in office for impeachment. Added to all this, he said, when none but men of opulence will hold a seat, what is there left to resist and repel this host of influence and power? And that brings us to the president. They all took the position that the executive branch placed way too much power and control in the hands of a single person. As Luther Martin put it, this would basically end up as a form of an elective monarchy in essence. He said, all this power will enable him, when he pleases, to become a king in name as well as in substance. The pardon power is one of the ways that they were very concerned about this. This was of particular concern for George Mason. He saw it as an open door invitation for crime and corruption. And this is how he described it. The President of the United States has the unrestrained power of granting pardons for treason, which may be sometimes exercised to screen from punishment those whom he had secretly instigated to commit the crime, and thereby prevent a discovery of his own guilt. Now, for Cato, it was the long term in office for the executive branch. Of course, they didn't have term limits then, but just a 4-year term. Of course, they all had issues with a 6-year term for the Senate, and they still saw 4 years as very, very problematic. He felt that this in and of itself would allow the president to basically build a system of patronage and personal loyalty. He said the deposit of vast trusts in the hands of a single magistrate enables him in their exercise to create a numerous train of dependents. This, he said, tempts his ambition, which in a Republican magistrate is also remarked to be pernicious. And the duration of his office for any considerable time favors his views, gives him the means and time to perfect and execute his design. So if you end up with an ambitious dude as president with all this power, well, you'd end up with a royal court, kind of like the royal courts of old Europe that they fought a long bloody war to secede from. And of course, he'd have unlimited power and total death of liberty. He said, he therefore fancies that he may be great and glorious by oppressing his fellow citizens and raising himself to permanent grandeur on the ruins of his country. Now, the Anti-Federalists saw each one of these weapons, taxation, the judiciary, standing armies, Congress, and the executive branch, as a weapon that would lead towards consolidation. We heard from George Mason, who thought just the taxing power would do it. The Pennsylvania dissent thought just the judicial power would end up with this. But tied together, it would be seriously, seriously bad. And Cato made the observation that even back then, the political, economic, and social viewpoints of the people were so different among the various states that, well, Here's how he put it. Whoever seriously considers the immense extent of territory comprehended within the limits of the United States, together with the variety of its climates, productions, and commerce, the difference of extent and number of inhabitants in all, the dissimilitude of interests, morals, and politics in almost every one, even then, they had so vastly different views from state to state and even within the states. He said because of this, because of these wide-ranging viewpoints, it would be impossible to achieve the promises that were made in the preamble. He said, you will receive it as an intuitive truth that a consolidated Republican form of government therein can never form a perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to you and your posterity. For to these objects it must be directed. Instead, we'd end up with competing interests, competing states, fighting against each other for power and control. He said, this unkindred legislature, therefore, composed of interests opposite and dissimilar in their nature, will in its exercise emphatically be like a house divided against itself. Put it all together, and George Mason gave us the final diagnosis. We would end up in the long run with one of two results, and both of them would be a deadly disease for liberty. He said this government will set out a moderate aristocracy. It is at present impossible to foresee whether it will, in its operation, produce a monarchy or a corrupt, tyrannical aristocracy. It will, he said, most probably vibrate some years between the two and then terminate in the one or the other. Did the Anti-Federalists call it? I think on plenty of this stuff, absolutely, almost prophetic, but they really were just like so many others at the time, students of history. You're never going to hear any of these lessons in the government-run and government-approved so-called education system. And that's a huge part of the reason why we work so hard every single day here at the TAC to reach and teach more and more people with these essential foundational principles from the founders and the old revolutionaries. And of course, it's a big part of the reason why Meharry and I work so hard to get this book done. Meharry did a lot of the early stuff. I did the final. I don't even know if he realizes that this is all done here. The Anti-Federalists were right. Martin Mason, Gary Cato, and the Pennsylvania dissenters, the case against ratification. I hope you'll pick it up on pre-order today over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/Anti-Federalists, or just continue watching this show for more and more stuff on the Anti-Federalists as we do it, more articles over on the website. And nothing helps us do this work, whether it's this show, the research that we do, the books that we put out, more than the financial faith and support of our members. If you want to help us out, a couple of bucks goes a long way here at the TAC. So if you've got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat that keeps devaluing day in and day out and year out, please visit us over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Our membership program starts out at just $2 a month. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. And I got to give you one more link, 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. I know some people don't like joining as members. They don't want to associate that way, and that's totally fine. If you want to make a one-time contribution, 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. Of course, there's a bunch of free and easy peasy things you can do to help us spread the word, primarily by taking actions that would trigger algorithms on the mainstream platforms. Like on YouTube, watch time percentage is a big one. A 30-minute video, you watch it for 30 minutes, 100%. You watch it for 90 minutes, that's 300% and way better. You can also leave reviews on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform, comments in the archive, subscribe, get notifications, hit like buttons, share links, etc., etc. You get the drift. I really appreciate your support. Thank you so much for spending some of your time with me today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I was interesting, maybe a little entertaining here and there, but more important than anything, I hope it made you think, and I hope you learned something. I really appreciate you spending your time with me today. I hope you have an awesome weekend, and I look forward to seeing you next week here on the Path to Liberty.